Marco, as well, for having me here today. Indeed, my job today is to actually try and make sure that the taxonomy is not anymore only, this big regulatory framework that Christian mentioned, but it's something that it's actually, in the essence, not too complex and something that can be used actually. So let me just quickly go through a bit of an introduction, what the taxonomy actually is, and what is the impact of the taxonomy in particular on lending institutions. Next slide, please. Okay, so to begin with, the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Activities is the cornerstone of the whole sustainable finance regulatory framework in the EU, because it is what provides the definition of what is green. Then, of course, there are other pieces, mostly, disclosure obligations. Of course, there is no obligation whatsoever to, run a sustainable business or invest in sustainable businesses, but there are some disclosure obligations. There are some tools that are built on the taxonomy, like, for example, the EU Green Bond Standard, and there are other pieces like ESG ratings. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the taxonomy is like a big dictionary, literally hundreds and hundreds of pages, defining what economic activities can be defined as sustainable or green if we only look at the environmental dimension, and under which conditions. Of course, the taxonomy can be used as a measuring tool, so to measure the degree of sustainability of an activity, and of course the financial investment that finances this activity, and can also be used, very importantly, as a transition tool, because it indicates when a particular activity can be defined green, and therefore it helps building so-called transition plans. It's important to stress that the taxonomy, as I said, is not a mandatory list to invest in, and that there isn't necessarily any link between, the greenness of an investment and the financial performance of that investment, although there is research around this. And it's also important to stress that activities that are not defined as green are not necessarily, quote unquote, brown or harmful. They might also be, so to say, irrelevant from a particular environmental perspective. So they're not harmful, but they're not green either. Next slide. So the taxonomy is structured around 6 environmental objectives, which are, of course, interlinked. 2 of them are related to climate change, so climate change mitigation and adaptation. And for these 2 objectives, a long list of activities that contribute substantially to these objectives of mitigation and adaptation has become law already in 2021. Then in 2022, there has been a so-called complementary delegated act, which added some activities that have to do with nuclear and gas. And in July this year, some more activities for mitigation and adaptation have been added. Then there are other 4 environmental objectives that have to do with circular economy, pollution prevention and control, water resources, and biodiversity and ecosystems. And these a list of activities that contribute to these 4 objectives has recently become EU law. Next slide, please. So when can an economic activity be defined as green? Essentially, it needs to provide a substantial contribution to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives that I just mentioned. At the same time, it needs to do no significant harm to any of the other 5 objectives, and it needs to comply with a set of minimum social safeguards. For substantial contribution and do no significant harm, there are a set of technical screening criteria, which are sometimes quantitative, so very clear thresholds, for example, no more than X tons of CO2 emission per unit of output, or can be qualitative. So there need to be, for example, an appropriate assessment of this particular risk. For minimum social safeguards, the taxonomy refers to the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. So to give you a concrete example, building a wind farm, of course, contributes substantially to the objective of climate change mitigation, but you cannot build it, next to an environmentally preserved area, and you cannot build it by using child labor. This seems an extreme example, but child labor is unfortunately used in many parts of the world, and European companies also invest in these other parts of the world. Next slide, please. So the taxonomy looks like this, essentially a list of activities for each environmental objective. These activities may be loosely or more or less loosely linked with economic sectors as classified in the NACE classification, which is the classification we use in Europe. And for each activity, there are criteria defining when this activity is making a substantial contribution and what this activity shall not do in order to avoid significant harm with respect to the other objectives. And the idea is to extend the taxonomy at some point to social objectives. Next slide, please. So to give you an example that is particularly interesting for lending institution, let's take the activity of construction of new buildings. So the substantial contribution with respect to climate change mitigation is defined by the primary energy demand of the building, which needs to be 10% lower than the criteria that defined nearly zero energy buildings. So nearly zero energy buildings are already particularly efficient buildings, but to be very honest, new constructions are often already compliant or need to be already compliant with these exact criteria. In order to be green also, according to the taxonomy, they need to be 10% better than NZ. At the same time, there are a set of do no significant harm criteria with respect to the other 5 objectives. So in terms of adaptation, there needs to be a robust climate risk and vulnerability assessment. So if the building is built, next to a river that's prone to flooding, then that's not good. In terms of water and marine resources, there is a set of very clear thresholds in terms of maximum water use for water appliances, but this does not apply to residential real estate. Apology. For circular economy, the criterion is that at least 70% of the construction and demolition waste needs to be prepared for reuse or recycling. In terms of pollution, there is, a list of EU laws which lists a list of polluting substances that, need to be absent, like mercury, formaldehyde, and others. In terms of biodiversity and ecosystems, there needs to be an environmental impact assessment. And if there are some measures that are required to preserve biodiversity and ecosystems, these need to be implemented. And also, the construction should not be on, fertile soil, destructing forest, and destructing, habitats of endangered species. So this is how the taxonomy works. Next slide, please. Now, there are criteria also for renovation of existing buildings, and a renovation of an existing building is providing a substantial contribution, can be taxonomy aligned, if it leads to an improvement in energy efficiency, which is of at least 30%. At the same time, there are the do no significant harm criteria. So again, there needs to be a climate risk vulnerability assessment, the same thresholds for water usage, the same criteria for circular economy, and the same criteria for pollution prevention and control. There are no criteria for biodiversity and ecosystem because the renovation is, of course, on an existing building, so you cannot really decide where the building is. It's already there. Next slide, please. And there are criteria for acquisition and ownership of buildings, and these are the criteria that banks and lending institutions should use to assess the taxonomy alignment of the mortgages they have on their balance sheet. And the criteria say that a mortgage can be taxonomy aligned if the underlying building has an energy performance certificate at least A, or it belongs to the top 15% in terms of energy efficiency of the national or regional building stock. Now, this can be quite challenging. First, because as you know very well, EPCs are not available for the vast majority of mortgages, and also because there aren't, as far as I know, I mean, there is a lot of work going on to define these, you know, what is the threshold defining this top 15% of buildings, but this is nowhere in the law. And at the same time, there is a do no significant harm technical screening criterion, which again has to do with a climate risk vulnerability assessment. Next slide, please. Now, let's change a bit the perspective and let's look at adaptation. So when is a building green in terms of adaptation? When adaptation solutions are implemented. So if the building, you know, is next to a river and prone to be flooded, well, there needs to be physical or immaterial measures taken. For example, you know, something that prevents water from flooding the building, or, you know, also insurance solutions. And there needs to be, again, a robust climate risk and vulnerability assessment. What is nice to notice is that, of course, in this case, there need to be do no significant harm criteria for climate change mitigation, and these are, of course, less demanding than for substantial contribution. So in this case, the building needs to have an EPC of C at least, or it needs to be in the top 30% of the building stock. And for recent constructions, it needs to be compliant with the NZEB criteria. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do financial institutions need to use the taxonomy for the disclosures that they will be mandated to? So all large financial institutions, so above 500 employees, will need to make these disclosures as of next year. And those with more than 250 employees, because of the CSRD, will need to make these disclosures as well as of 2026. So how do they calculate the taxonomy alignment of a financial portfolio? In theory, that's simple, of course. One uses, you know, portfolio weights to weight the exposures, and it makes a weighted average based on the level of taxonomy alignment of the counterpart, be it an investee company or a borrower. And these can be based on the level, on the share of revenues that are taxonomy aligned on the side of the borrower, or on the share of capital expenditure of the borrower or investee company that's taxonomy aligned. Next slide, please. The banks in particular will need to disclose the so-called green asset ratio, which aims at expressing the proportion of the bank's assets that are invested in taxonomy aligned activities as a share of total assets. In practice, it's a bit more complicated because the calculation is not as straightforward. There are particular rules that need to be followed. For example, exposures to SMEs and non-EU counterparties are excluded from the numerator of the GAR because these particular counterparties don't have an obligation themselves to disclose their taxonomy alignment. So banks would not have this information. So for the moment, these exposures are excluded, but the inclusion of these loans will be considered in next year after an impact assessment. Sovereign exposures are excluded also from the denominator of the GAR. Green bonds can be included based on their actual level of taxonomy alignment. So, as you know, Not all green bonds are equal. Some follow the taxonomy, some others don't. But what's very important also is that, you know, financial institutions can also disclose voluntary KPIs that may include estimates of exposures to those asset classes that are not included in the mandatory GAR. Next slide, please. So this is the schedule of disclosures, as I said, as of next, so this year, non-financial corporates are starting to disclose their taxonomy alignment. And as of next year, based on these data that are coming out this year, financial institutions will need to calculate their own taxonomy alignment. Next slide, please. And this is the schedule of disclosures for the taxonomy alignment, including the other 4 environmental objectives. So it's essentially shifted by 2 years because the list came out this year. Next slide, please. I think that was the last indeed. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Lucia. And now we are going to be switching to the ENGAGE templates with Vincent. That is going to go through the specific part of the templates that have been developed over the last year.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vincent Mahieu. I work at Hypoport, and I will be showing you the templates, the first version of the template that we have created. I would like to introduce shortly the ENGAGE project and basically its most important use cases and why we created these templates in the first place. What were some of our design considerations in creating these templates? And I think a really important element is really converting the EU taxonomy that was mentioned in the previous presentation into concrete data requirements that work in multiple jurisdictions in the EU. As you can imagine, this was quite a challenge, but I think we have a solid first version. And today we will look purely into the substantial contribution criteria for acquisition and ownership for the environmental objective of climate change mitigation. So first, a little bit about the project. What we have found when looking into a lot of the current European and forthcoming regulations with respect to ESG, that are relevant for mortgages or specifically for the funding of residential mortgages, we found a common denominator, mainly that the taxonomy regulation was kind of the core where a lot of other regulations and directives are, let's say, borrowing from in terms of the EU taxonomy as a classification system for ESG or green assets. So when we identified that and we looked at, well, what's relevant with respect to mortgage reporting today and in the future, we see a lot of developments, a new EU green bond standards, a political movement financing the renovation wave, additional attention with respect to investor disclosure, but also, for instance, the central bank here in Frankfurt signaled that they only want to buy taxonomy-aligned assets. So again, from that perspective, the taxonomy alignment is the common denominator. So that's why we created this this template, and that's also what I want to walk you through. Just maybe to highlight it, we have a couple of use cases why we focused on getting a template for taxonomy alignment for residential mortgages. So we wanted to address a couple of questions. The first one is, what data is needed to gain insight into the renovation potential? The second one was, do we know what data is needed if we want to, let's say, prove taxonomy alignment for a mortgage? Do we know what kind of adaptation solutions are applicable for each of the individual economic activities in Chapter 7? And do we know how to interpret or read and understand the EU taxonomy? From funding or more as an investor perspective, how can we create from a data perspective, a future-proof funding framework? How can I make a future portfolio ECB eligible in terms of taxonomy alignment? And can we identify, let's say, the data ingredients that we would need for the EU Green Bond Standard? And also, how would this compare in my portfolio compared to another portfolio? And let's say you want to have a mandate for a certain percentage of green investment. So you want to, let's say, allocate your funds to taxonomy aligned assets, for instance, renovations. Are you able to identify these eligible investments? Well, with these use cases, we all think that the common denominator is the framework, the ENGAGE framework. So basically our template for taxonomy aligned mortgages. The project is a cooperation between a couple of companies here in the consortium, very short European DataWarehouse, Hypoport, Javoskari University, and then 2 financial institutions, UCI and WONU, and DEXI, our legal and AI advisor in Spain, Italy. And we want to focus basically also in this project on both the funding side, so the investor side, but also what works for consumers. So we're trying to take into account a holistic approach. So maybe to extend a little bit on the previous presentation, which was about the, let's say, the introduction of the EU taxonomy, I would like to pick it up from there. So currently in our scope, what we did is that we looked at the EU taxonomy as a classification system. It was already explained in the previous presentation, but more concretely, we look into the Climate Delegate Act and actually for now only into Annex 1 for climate change mitigation. And the reason why we only currently look into this environmental objective and, for instance, currently not into the, there was a slide on it on the previous presentation, the one for climate change adaptation, is that there's no mandatory green asset ratio yet for that environmental objective. So the closest in the short term is the disclosure of taxonomy alignment via the green asset ratio for the climate change mitigation objectives. So that's what our priority is on in the short term. Well, basically, the 3 building blocks to prove something is sustainable: substantial contribution, do no significant harm, and comply with minimum safeguards. These are the 3 elements that we have to look at. Only for the first 2, we find additional, or basically the technical screening criteria in Annex 1. Well, as mentioned, as we only currently look into climate change mitigation, because that's the only one where you have in the short term a report obligation, we look into the economic activities of Chapter 7. More importantly, as indicated here in bold, we look into acquisition and ownership of buildings. And in this first session, we will be focusing on substantial contribution, acquisition and ownership of buildings, and comply with the minimum safeguards. So in this session, we will not discuss or talk about do no significant harm, as we currently have not, we're still, let's say, working on that in terms of interpreting the data elements that are relevant there. So how did we convert this into the templates? We take a phased approach. We started with the substantial contribution criteria for existing buildings. The reason being that there's a report obligation for this environmental objective, and we think that the criteria for the existing buildings are the most important ones in the short term. And also currently, we see when talking with a lot of financial institutions that the renovation criteria and the do not significant harm criteria are relatively, let's say, challenging to prove. So that will follow in phase 2 and 3, and later on we will look into the use of proceeds reporting, the EU Green Bond Standards, and also the EIF, EIB templates. And the way we tackled this is, well, we needed a starting point for our analysis, and we did an investigation. What is the, let's say, currently in the market in terms of data granularity, the most detailed mortgage template in existence? And we found it to be, it's not a surprise, but the securitization regulation disclosure. So Annex 2 and Annex 6 with the loan level data and the collateral information. If we look into that data format currently, we see it can be roughly divided into 3 sections: information on the assets, information on the transaction structure, and information on the liabilities. So what we try to do is to find basically common denominators in all of the environmental regulations that we can use. So having identified the critical data elements, we kind of bring the additional green elements together with what we have currently in existence for the mortgage reporting. So in essence, these two are dovetailed together. So what you can imagine is that it's a lot of additional information on a collateral level, on a climate risk level, but also on a loan level and different new levels that are currently not in existing templates. For instance, allocation reporting, use of proceeds information, or information on the minimum safeguards. So taking that perspective in a quite literal sense here, so the ENGAGE template structure is based, this first version, on the basically as an add-on to the securitization regulation. What we did here is just give an overview of, which many of you might be familiar with today, of the information with respect to the loan level templates. And we looked at this field by field, looked at the EU taxonomy, and well, identified where are some of the gaps in the data elements. And we found, particularly when looking at the collateral information, the RREC, that well, basically some fields are missing there. So we made a suggestion in the ENGAGE template to add some fields on that level. And secondly, we identified a new level, we call it the ENGAGE governance file, with some additional information, which is not per se on a loan level or on a collateral level. So we identified a new hierarchical data level. Our purpose here is that ideally for us, this is a flexible or modular template. So not per se securitization is the only point of departure. So it's also possible to just use the asset information and the ENGAGE governance file to use it for a mortgage portfolio pool, or let's say other structures in the future, such as a covered bond or other structures, mortgage funds, for instance. So it's not per se only for securitization, although it is based in the core on some of the elements of the securitization disclosure elements, but keeping in mind that we made it modular and cut off some of the very securitization specific data fields that are not always relevant. So the ENGAGE templates, we try to make it flexible. So it should work for secured funding, unsecured funding as a transaction structure, but also on an individual loan. So a secured loan, in other words, a mortgage, or an unsecured loan, in other words, a personal loan. Both we are able to cater in the ENGAGE framework. And also some country-specific elements, such as multiple loan parts that exist in some countries, and also more, let's say, the challenging scenarios that we encounter. Let's say a loan that is simultaneously aligned with multiple substantial contribution criteria. Let's say a loan can be identified for the economic activity 7.3 and 7.6 at the same time. So this is renewables and renovation works at the same time. So all these, basically, we gave ourselves kind of these requirements in designing the template. Again, we're taking into account a lot of the country-specific elements that there are, such as different building codes, different EPC methodologies, etc. So if we look into basically chapter 7 of the climate change mitigation annex, we see several subsections: acquisition and ownership, then a block in the middle for let's say renovations, 7.2 also renovations, and 7.1 construction of new buildings. So the way we approach this is, do we really understand the wording in the taxonomy, while asking ourselves, how can this work in practice? Are there any jurisdiction-specific considerations we have to take in mind? And how can we convert that into data elements? So on the right-hand side, we identified the different, let's say, the 3 building blocks we showed earlier: substantial contribution criteria, the do no significant harm, and the minimum safeguards. What you can see very clearly from this picture, for instance, is that the do no significant harm criteria really change in the context of the economic activity. As you see, for 7.3, there are 2 do no significant harm criteria, whereas for 7.2, all the do no significant harm criteria are relevant. Today, we will be focusing on 7.7, and will not cover do no significant harm, but it's good to know that here only Appendix A is relevant, which is currently gray, but only 1 do no significant harm criteria will need to be proved, if you will. So the ENGAGE templates that we created, now we get to the meat and potatoes of our work. Our starting point, maybe it's good to highlight, because we are going to make some assumptions in the following slides. So what is it based on? What are some of the, let's say, documents we have taken into account or not taken into account? So clearly we looked into the taxonomy regulation, number 1, number 2, the Climate Delegate Act, number 3, the Annex on Climate Change Mitigation. We discussed this already a few slides ago, but an important element is number 6, is the Q&A that was published in December on the technical screening criteria, on the interpretation of the EU taxonomy. And let's just say there are a lot of nuances in that document that we have also taken into account. Well, as we are discussing, or I am talking at this very moment, also roughly around this time, probably also a new Q&A will be published. So that's very interesting to monitor as well, and taking into account as soon as possible. So having said that, 7.7, we look into the 3 basically elements that are there. The reason, again, it's very, I think, important for everyone that's currently looking into the taxonomy. We start with this substantial contribution criteria, that we think this is the most important one. One, because we think existing real estate is the largest chunk of European balance sheets for financial institutions. The second element is that we have the convenience that for 7.7, the whole loan can be attributed to the whole amount of the loan of the balance towards the taxonomy alignment or the green asset ratio. And this is not the case for other criteria, for instance, 7.2 or 7.3 for renovation, where only a fraction of the loan can be considered as sustainable. And well, lastly, I think this is also relatively, compared to other criteria, more reasonable to do, or more, let's say, in the short term feasible to prove, even though we have identified, I think, still some challenging elements. So then on the wording in the purple box, we basically identified 3 subsections. So one is for buildings built before 31st December 2020. It's not a coincidence this date was chosen, I think, because that was also the moment the most recent EPBD 3 Energy Performance for Buildings Directive was implemented, supposed to be implemented in EU member states. So we have criteria for buildings built before 31st of December. So there should be an EPC of class A, or as an alternative, the building should be in the top 15. And then third, we have for buildings built after 31st December, a criteria where we have to look into the substantial contribution criteria 7.1. We'll look into that in a second. As I mentioned, our storyline is based on the most recent public available information, so the Q&A. I want to highlight a couple of elements we deem relevant of the Q&A when considering or analyzing these topics. I've highlighted them here on the right-hand side, and because they're relevant for 7.7. So, for instance, what about the question was addressed? The differences in EPC certificates and methodologies in countries. Does that matter, or to what degree should these differences be taken into account? I think, in particular, relevant questions for financial institutions that operate in multiple jurisdictions. Well, as it got answered, as long as it's an officially produced EPC, we are fine. Then I think another element, because I will not address all of them, but we'll circulate the slide so you can have a look yourself. A really important one is on the bottom of the screen, 106. So here the question was raised, is the construction of new buildings, in for instance 7.1, how do we determine which criteria we need to apply, as in before or after the 31st of December 2020? So how do we determine that date? And the answer that was provided is that the date of submission of the complete application is the relevant date for deciding which technical screening criteria to apply at that point in time. Then the construction of new buildings. If we look at this in terms of using the criteria for 7.1, how about let's say when do we use 7.1 and when do we use 7.7? This question was addressed in question 107, but also in question 147 below. So the construction of new buildings for own use, and I think this is extremely relevant for residential real estate, can be covered under section 7.1 or section 7.7, acquisition and ownership of buildings. There's of course a big difference, because for 7.7 you would need to abide by a lot more do no significant harm criteria compared to 7.1. So also here in answer 144, again we get the same the same confirmation in terms of the homeowner. 7.7 can be applied in the context of residential real estate. So if we try to simplify basically some of the answers, when to use 7.1 or 7.7, we think it all is a question with respect to who receives the financing, as addressed in the Q&A. So if it's an undertaking, we look into 7.1. If it's a homeowner, we look into the criteria of 7.7. And this dictates the use of, let's say, the relevant economic activities. So for buildings built before 31st December, let's make it concrete. We have to use an EPC of class A. Well, that's pretty straightforward, but maybe a few elements to highlight that we found interesting. There's an emphasis on the word certificate, so that's seems to suggest it should be a legal, valid document with a validity date that's still valid. So emphasis on the word certificate. And we have to assess if the building was built before 31st of December 2020. And as was noted, we have to look into the construction permit application date to assess if a building was built before or after 31st of December. So these are, let's say, good elements to keep in mind. We've highlighted these, let's say, considerations when applying it in the gray box below, the key considerations. We try to, let's say, convert this. How would this relate into, if you look into the ENGAGE template, into the data fields? Well, if we look into this table in black, the first couple of data fields are just the existing fields in the disclosure template that are currently in the Annex 2. So are just to identify the portfolio, the loan, the obligor, etc. And then, yeah, if we convert this criterion into data points, we found or identified, in this case, the green data field. So we need the EPC class, we need to know the issuance date and if it's still a valid EPC, and we need to know the permit application date in the assessment, because the Q&A says that we need to have this data field in order to assess whether it's built before or after 31st December 2020. So that's it for the first part of 7.7. Then, as an alternative, the building is within the top 15 of the national or regional building stock, as expressed by prime energy demand, evidenced by a study, public study, that also divides the building stock in before or after 31st of December. And I think this is an interesting one because the top 15 criteria are already in use in a lot of, let's say, proprietary green bond frameworks throughout Europe as of today. So I think definitely the taxonomy took inspiration from that, but the difference here is that we need to make a cutoff before 31st December again. Second, we have to divide the building stock into residential and non-residential buildings. So basically it's a top 15, but with two important filters, and that makes it a little bit, let's say, different compared to the normal, your typical top 15. So to our knowledge, in many countries, in many frameworks, there are a lot of methodologies to assess the top 15. Almost by definition, the top 15 is an estimation technique. Of course, in an ideal world, you would have all building units in a country and you would have the data on all their EPCs and their prime energy demand, and you would rank them and just select the top 15. But to our knowledge, there's no country in Europe that has EPCs or prime energy demands valid basically for the complete building stock. So in some shape or form, an estimation technique will need to be applied. So we catered for that as well. So we identified a couple of data fields to assess whether an individual building is within, or let's say outside, the top 15. So we kind of visualize this here. If we were to make a frequency distribution of the prime energy demand in a certain region, again, remember the filters we have to apply: built before 31st of December 2020, and distinguish at least between residential and non-residential. And basically assess whether it's in the top 15 or not. Well, taking this into account, there are a couple of elements that we think are important. If we look into the Q&A, quite some emphasis is being put on the public character of this basically top 15 study. So I think that's an important one. So it should be publicly available, and interested parties will need to be able to really see the study. So what we did is converted that into data elements. So in black, again, we have the typical identification field. So which loans are we looking at, which timestamp, etc. And then in green, we have basically identified a couple of fields, whether this reference asset or this building unit is in the top 15, yes or no. So these are in green. Of course, here again, we included the construction year and the construction permit application date to assess if it's built before or after 31st of December 2020. And these fields are on the collateral level. And that's a little bit different compared to some of the data elements in this table that are highlighted in purple, as you can see. And these are part of the government file. And the reason we have included that is that it's a different hierarchical, let's say, data level. It's just one row of data, but we included the ability for parties to also give information to this public study, some information on the geographical scope, the numerator, denominator, and also the link to the study. Again, all just appealing to some of the answers of the Q&A. And then for the last part, acquisition and ownership of buildings. This is an interesting one. So there's a little, let's say, link here. For buildings built after 31st December, we will have to look into the criteria of 7.1. So basically, there's a line between 7.7 and 7.1. And in 7.1, we have to look into the criteria where we need to do a 10% check on the prime energy demand and assess whether that's lower than the threshold set in the national or regional threshold for buildings. Again, here we see the link towards this date, 31st December. It's also the date that the Energy Performance for Building Directive needed to be applied. More specifically, also the NZEB, the Near Zero Energy Building criteria, needs to be incorporated into EU member states. So basically, it's a check on the NZEB and then 10% stricter than the NZEB norm. So this assessment will need to be done on the building or building unit level. It depends a bit on how it's implemented in the country. The Q&A has some really interesting comments on that, so I highly recommend you look into that as well. So we have to determine if we look into a building that's built after 31st December 2020, if it's an NZEB building, because NZEB is not always incorporated in each country yet. There's some delay in certain jurisdictions, so please be aware of that. And when it's an NZEB, we need to check if it's 10% stricter or not. Again, here it's a good example where we need to take into account sometimes certain country or region specific considerations. As we see, or if we look into, let's say, the norms for new constructions, the NZEB buildings in many different countries, we see that the criteria can depend, for instance, on a specific region, and in some countries or regions, it can also depend on the building type, and sometimes both. So apartments could have different criteria compared to, let's say, family homes. And this could differ per region, as we see sometimes geographic region in certain countries, but in other countries this could be climate region, for instance. So something really to be aware of. What is the jurisdiction you're looking at? What are the local thresholds, and are there differences per building type? Often that is the case, and are there differences per, let's say, region or climate area? Well, and then the 10%. That I think is self-explanatory, but that should be checked and should be assessed. So we need to know the threshold value. Let's say it's 50. 10% stricter, that's 45. So if your building is 46, it doesn't meet the criteria. If it is 44, it meets the criteria. Not all buildings will pass this test, and so that's important to know. So in many countries, the typical concern of a municipality or a homeowner is, do I abide by the building code? Normally, you would say that's the most important thing. And typically consumers are not really, or maybe financial institutions that are not really aware of this criterion are not too concerned how much lower it is than the building code threshold. So yeah, currently we see that unfortunately in some countries a lot of buildings don't meet this criterion, the 10%. So please be aware of that. I think a couple of elements are really worth paying attention to here in the Q&A. So the 10% criterion will need to be checked as an as-is energy performance assessment. That's how it's formulated in the taxonomy and in the Q&A. So in many countries, there's like let's say a prime energy demand calculation as part of the building permit application. And once the, let's say, building is finalized, you can do a physical inspection by walking through the building and measure the actual, let's say, final energy performance of the building unit. So it's really something to be sharp of and keep in mind. There could be, of course, the case that you are financing a new construction based on the plans. It will meet the 10% criterion, but you could have the use case that when the building is finalized, the homeowner gets the keys, walks through the building, you will get the final EPC, and you still have to assess at that point in time, does it still meet the 10% check, yes or no? So we converted that in certain data elements, again in black, the fields just to identify the data fields, and then we look into the fields that we need. So again, construction year, permit application date, which is often, as we encounter, challenging to obtain that data fields, unfortunately. And we have to look into the EPC, the prime energy demand, and for that building, the NZEB threshold. So yeah, that's basically the most important data points to perform this check. So that's the last substantial contribution criteria. Well, as I mentioned, we also assessed the minimum safeguards in the design of the first version of the template. It's good maybe to note that the minimum safeguards are listed in document 1, the taxonomy regulation, and there are no technical screening criteria for minimum safeguards. So we just have to look into the actual core taxonomy regulation text. And that's a little bit, well, let's just say we see that a lot of parties are looking for guidance here because to prove minimum safeguards, you would need to, let's say, abide by certain standards. But abiding by these standards is laid upon the undertaking. And a little bit the challenge that we have here is that if you, let's say, in the perspective of financing residential real estate, yeah, are you financing an undertaking in this perspective? Or can you say that a residential homeowner is not an undertaking? Unfortunately, and this would be the easiest solution, the term undertaking is not defined in the taxonomy regulation. So maybe if they update it in the coming year, they could define what an undertaking is in this context. So for the minimum safeguards, we've created some optional fields. We think, but with the current guidance, this is particularly relevant for 7.1 when financing to entities undertaken. So we basically created placeholder data fields where parties can link towards how they abide by the 4 standards mentioned, here indicated on the right-hand side. But we yeah, are still a little bit in doubt whether that's also needed for when you fund or finance a residential homeowner, since a residential homeowner is not an undertaking. So I don't think the last word has been said about this part, and probably additional guidance will come, maybe in the Q&A, maybe in the updated taxonomies in the new year. So I think that's to be continued. So if we summarize all of this, we talked about substantial contribution and the minimum safeguards. And this, we have already said, this is what we think is the most important element currently to focus on for the green asset ratio. So 7.7, what are some key topics? In the end, it depends, was the building built before or after 31st of December? How do we assess that? We need the application date of the construction permit. And then we have some alternatives here. Look into the EPC if it's available. As an alternative, we can look into if it's in the top 15% of residential buildings built before 31st of December. Or if it's built after 31st of December, we look into 7.7.2, but basically there's a link to look into 7.1, which was the 10% criterion that we have just explained. So summarizing it all, the ENGAGE data, it's an add-on to existing mortgage framework. We're continuing to develop it and add other data elements in the future to, let's say, prove do no significant harm, renovation, and other elements. So it's modular, but we also want to make it scalable. And as a last point, I want to say there's so much development. I think everybody that follows the ESG development sees that a lot of publications come out, Q&As, updated guidance documents. So there is a need, and we are very aware of that, to continuously improve that. So highly recommend you can register to see or download, if you haven't already, the ENGAGE templates. I've included a snippet of it here on the lower right-hand side. This add-on that we created to annex to, it's maybe good to mention as a last remark that all the data fields that we, let's say, came up with are optional fields in that sense. So there's no failing check on it. But what we have done is that we have created what we call conditional filters. So highlighted there in green in the screenshot on the right-hand side of the screenshot. But what we did is that for 7.71, the top 15 and the 10% check, you can basically in the spreadsheet, click on the filter and you see what fields we use. And you see not only what fields we use to check the taxonomy alignment, but the full taxonomy alignment amount up to the euro specifically. So please have a look into that. And then I would like to give the word to Marco.
Thanks a lot, Vincent. That's very detailed, and as you can understand, there is a lot of effort that has gone in the last year into creating this template. Thanks also to our colleagues from European DataWarehouse, Gianluca Ginelli. But now is the turn of Cátia Alves from Unión de Créditos Inmobiliarios. Cátia is one of the two pilots of the ENGAGE for ESG consortium, and we want to learn from her how is she preparing for the ENGAGE templates. Clearly, there is a lot of devil in the detail, but Cátia, is over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marco. First of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak about our commitment about the consortium and what is our effort to be compliant with taxonomy. First of all, I would like to say that UCI is a specialized lender on mortgages and loans, especially on everything that is related to sustainable finance. So we want to foster the rehabilitation on buildings, on real estate buildings, and also to incentivize citizens at the same time to be committed with sustainability. Our journey has started in 2017 when we joined the MF, and from there till now we have become we have become very specialized on these matters about sustainability. I would like to highlight that on 2020 we have launched the Green Belane, the securitization that had green bond on the backing the securitization. And in that first contract, we have joined our forces with the EIB in order to foster all this sustainable finance in Spain and Portugal as well. On 2021, we have launched the second green securitization, also with the EIB as our partner, this time to foster the rehabilitation works, to incentivize citizens to renovate their houses, their buildings, regarding sustainable matters. And on 2022, we launched the third one, and we as well an Elena project with the EIB that is called the RARE project, Residential Energy Rehabilitation, to foster citizens to renovate their buildings according to energy performance. And on 2023, this year, we launched the third securitization fund, Green Fund, orientated as well to renovation real estate stockage, and also to promote new buildings and transactions of high EPCs on the real estate. So this has been our journey since the first times we started working with these matters. Next slide, please. In this journey, I would like also to highlight that we have been working in terms with in an ecosystem. I would like to highlight the fact that it's key to work with other companies. We are banks, we are financial services, and we have to find the correct renovation companies, the correct servicers to do the EPCs, to do the draws about sustainable matters on the house, etc., etc. So it's crucial to obtain some sort of an ecosystem because each one has a different expertise, and for taxonomy matters, different expertises are needed. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to explain a little bit about what are we doing about our alignment to these ENGAGE templates or to taxonomy, to become taxonomy compliant. I would like to highlight the fact that for UCI is crucial, the process, methodology and process are crucial, because at the end, this is not work about direction on the company, it's a teamwork. And at the same time, if we get all the information that we need on the origination, when we analyze all the walkthrough of the process, you'll see that if we gather all the information in the beginning of the process, in the origination, when we sell a mortgage or when we sell a loan, it's much easier to obtain this information. So we have divided our process, our granting process, into phases. First is the mortgage loan, and the other is the loan, a consumer loan. So let's look at the mortgage loan. The mortgage loan has two different types of approach. The first one, it's our portfolio. It's otherwise. So it's our portfolio. What we have, we have. And what we have to analyze. UCI has analyzed what we have in our portfolio and what was originated until 2013. We had to get the estimations of the EPC and the kilowatts per hour savings and the CO2 emissions also with a servicer. A servicer has, as an expert, an energy expert, has made these estimations. So because till that time, there's no kind of obligation about having any kind of energy performance in the bank's database. Nevertheless, through 2013, in Spain, we were obliged at that time to, in the time of the deed, to obtain the EPC on the day of the deed. So even though we don't have the information charged in our database, we had the files scanned, digitalized in our system. So we made an OCR process to charge all the information that we had in the documentation to charge in a database. So we have solved our portfolio. Our portfolio, we have 2 points. The first is estimation till 2013. 2013, and after 2013 we have the real ones that were digitalized. Okay, so good so far. So far so good. So from new origination, from origination loans, mortgage loans, we demand our commercial teams, when they sell a mortgage, to obtain the information about the EPC. It's a concept of changing the mindset. It says that we analyze the credit, the client, we analyze the client risk, the credit risk of the client, and we have also to analyze the energy performance. And the energy performance we analyze through the appraisal document with the recent EPC on it. So we have incorporated an obligation of having this document, the EPC, on before doing the deed. So we have the analysis of the credit risk of the client and also the EPC. Next slide, please. For renovation loans, so we have set out the mortgage part. The loans are the ones that are going to are the ones that have gained a lot of importance and relevance in the market these last 2 years because of the decarbonization of the stockage, of the real estate stockage. The European Commission, as you know, has fostered all the economies to decarbonize and to fight climate change due to the rehabilitation works, the renovation works. That is to renovate buildings. It's not to renovate only a household. Is to renovate all the building. So in this type of loans, we have two matters also: the portfolio, what we have already in our portfolio, and in origination loans. This line of business at 2UCI is quite new, has 4 years old more or less. And from the beginning, when we joined the forces with the IB, we had to report to them our energy savings, and we had to identify since the beginning, since 2020, what were our energy savings, and we identify if the loans had if the renovation works at a saving of 30% improvement on the PED, we would consider it green. So we were at the time already aligned with this taxonomy regulation. So the 7.2, as Vincent explained. So for the portfolio and for the origination loans, we have included the documentation about the EPC before, the project on the rehabilitation works, and at the end of the works, we demand a second EPC to check against the first one if we have embraced or not the 30% of energy savings on the PED. Next slide, please. So this is about the documents that we use that you can check later on the presentation. I'm not going to drill in on each one of them, but it's crucial to integrate the documents that we use to check if a loan or a mortgage is eligible or not for taxonomy. It's mandatory to have them in order to have traceability in our database system. So as well as you demand the salaries of a client to analyze if he is eligible or not to give him a credit, you have to integrate this kind of concepts to the collateral matters regarding the energy performance. Next slide, please. These also are the documents that we use, from whom we extract the documents. As I said before, it's crucial, the process, and it's crucial to involve all the team from thought to finish, from start to finish. We have to integrate commercial teams, technical teams, IT teams, structured finance teams, sustainable teams, etc. in all of this process, so it flows in a good way and to embrace all the information that we need to be able to report at the end. Next slide, please. We have already prepared with other directions of the company the ESMA reporting, so we have a lot of experience already in reporting all this detailed information. It's crucial also to have information loan by loan, because it's how the central bank are demanded it, is how the Pillar 3 ESG is demanding it, and the ESMA reporting also is about the loan by loan approach, and this ENGAGE template will be also loan by loan approach, and is important for you to have in your database this information about loan by loan approach. Next slide, please. As I said before, to collect and report data, companies' team are needed. This is not a stank team. This is not a team that is closed between four walls. Is a team that you have to speak with the IT teams. It's mandatory to speak with the IT teams, with commercial teams, for them to understand the benefits of having this information, for them to put in value what is good to sell the client, that if his loan or mortgage is or not green eligible, taxonomy eligible. So we have to work with all the teams of the company, with the marketing department, in order to put the good words, the good slogans, etc., to put it in value to the client. It's not only a matter of having, it's a matter of how you communicate and how you explain to every stakeholders of this process the benefits of it. Next slide, please. This is the traffic lights classification that UCI has done to identify what kind of information we have already at our disposal for reports, and the information that we think that is maybe available in the next in the next months. So the green lights are the information that we have already. The yellow lights are information that we think we can obtain on the process. And there we didn't identify any kind of information that is impossible to obtain, because at the end, all of this information is either of the client's information or from the collateral information. So we can obtain all of this information. The only one that is harder to obtain is due to the harmonized information and public information that depends on the country that we are in. So we are expecting that the Spanish government releases all the public information on a web about the EPC distribution, for instance, or at the same time about the physical risks of climate change. So this kind of information is mandatory to have it in a harmonized way, where every bank can use it from a unique source, and not each one do the struggle on their own. Next slide, please. The benefits about the ENGAGE template. It's about to improve efficiency, because at this time we can identify several units at the company that are reporting different things. So this file would be used to report several different reports to mandatory, regulatory, internal, external, to the shareholders, to investors, etc. So we'll obtain efficiency. I think 2024 will be a year of changings, and a year where the business is in the center, and as well efficiency and efficacy. So I think the ENGAGE template would be very efficient for us, because everything will be centered in one single thing. At the same time, the data quality, something is is a problem to several companies. So the data must be consistent. We have to have a quality data, and data that can be used by all the company, and to present it outside the company as well. So data quality is assured by using this ENGAGE template as well. What can I say? Increases the part about visibility in the market, etc. For the challenges, are the fact of the Spanish government that are working very hard on having this only website where we can get the climate risks, about the exposure of the Spanish climate risks, and also about the EPCs. And for the future, I would say, as a closure remarks, I would insist, if anyone can ask me about the process, methodology is mandatory in this kind of projects to be taxonomy compliant, and to use it as an opportunity, not to use it only as a must done thing, but an opportunity, something that we have to do, the financial companies. Nevertheless, it's we can change it, and we can use it as an opportunity to be the first players in the market, using it as an advantage with other stakeholders. That's all. Thank you so much, Marco, once again.
Thanks, Cátia. Thanks for and also to Vincent and to Lucia, Alessi. This is we are getting towards the end of the 1 hour and a half webinar. Clearly, you can get in touch with us in terms of possibly having and accessing not only the templates, but also the possibility of having kind of one-to-one discussions. So how do you engage now? You can, for the templates, you can go on the website, the ENGAGE website, and download, request the templates. Usually in 1 or 2 days maximum, you will receive. All this presentation is going to be made available also on the ENGAGE website. You can see now the form that is on the website as well. You just need to put the point person, the company, and some further details. Clearly, the templates also are they will continue evolving. We are at a version 1, but what is fundamental is one of the slides that Cátia was also showing earlier in terms of the availability of the information. We believe that this is available, maybe with some effort. But it's very important. The devil is in the details. So to have you engaged as much as possible over the next month. I also take this opportunity to wish you all happy Christmas time. We will be in touch. We are starting with for new events over the course of 2024. We have already one event scheduled for the 1st of February with some Greek banks in Athens, but we will circulate the schedule so that you will be able to continue participating and to have also some technical discussions, because we are going to continue drilling down on some of the technical issues that Vincent was mentioning, with some practical examples, with some guiding notes, etc., so that it will be easier also to understand and to interpret also from a compiling perspective, reporting perspective, what needs to be reported into the templates. Also, some companies you can also test the templates, not only the 2 pilots, but we welcome also other lending institutions to really participate and get involved across all European jurisdictions. So we're agnostic also from that perspective, and we want to learn whether the templates that we have developed are valid and they can be applied all across Europe, or if we need to take in consideration some also the national nuances. But with that, this is all. I would like to thank you all the speakers, and wish you the best holiday season. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.